Alright, this is a review of Eminent Domain with the Escalation expansion. Eminent Domain came out a couple of years ago, I guess, and the expansion is fairly recent. I believe it was sometime, gee, I'm not sure exactly when the expansion came out, but it's been out for a little while too. The base game of Eminent Domain by itself is a pretty good game, but for me it was getting really dry and really repetitive the way that it was, and it was a game where, quite frankly, if the expansion hadn't come out, it probably would have hit the trade shelf or the sell shelf. But I have to say the expansion has done a lot of good for this game. I'll kind of go over a little bit of what the expansion has done. Well, first of all, it's added a lot of cards to the deck. Not all these expansion cards, but the ones with the little tiny E in the corner. So this one, this one, this one, and they're scattered throughout all of these different decks here. There are new cards. There are a few completely new ways to get cards, because usually your cards are dependent upon the planets that you have, and I believe this one is, you can get this if you have one of each type of planet. So there's different ways to get new cards in it. Another thing that's added to the game is something to do with the warfare, and you get these cards here to start the game, and you're going to be able to trade ships to get these larger ships. And when the game first came out, it had these other ships in it, and there was no mention of what these were for in the rule book, so people were just kind of assuming, well, this one's going to be worth maybe 5 of the little fighters, and this is worth 10. I mean, you could do that. But there really was no explanation or rationale for having these in here. And it turns out that the designer, when he got the molds for the ship, for these little ships, it just kind of came with these other ships too. And he left it kind of wide open in case he wanted to add something else in the future. And so when he did the expansion, he found a use for those other types of ships. So now these medium grade ships, they're a completely different kind of ship, and you can upgrade them from these 3 ships. And then you can also take 2 of the mid-range ships and get one of these larger ships, which is also worth a victory point at the end of the game. And you can actually upgrade this card too to make it easier to get those types of ships. And that's a nice feature added to the warfare. You know, when I first started playing the game, I kind of thought, well, maybe that kind of feels maybe a little bit tacked on, but it is growing on me a little bit. So I do like that mechanic. I like the way it's working out now. And you'll see some of the planets in here, like for example, this planet here now has a symbol on it for one of those medium range ships, and that wasn't in the base game. And you can see that to conquer this planet, you're either going to have to go colonize or get one of those medium grade ships. And there's, they're seated throughout the deck now. Here's one where you have to have one of those big ships to get it by warfare. So that's added to the game. Probably my favorite feature that's added to the game, and I especially like the technologies things, but I really like these scenario cards which are added to the game. And what happens is you're going to get one of these scenario cards to start the game, and you can do however you want. You can deal out some and have people pick one, or you can maybe draft them, however you want to do it. But you're going to start with a scenario, and the one that I have here is Abundance. And what you're going to do here is you're going to get these cards, which there's a variety, and you can see, for example, the starting deck for Fertile Ground is 3 colonize, 2 of these industry trade cards, and so forth. But you can see that now this one's got a little bit more of a balanced deck to start the game. There is like a card in here where you start with nothing. You start with no deck. And that's kind of funny. I played that once. But you start with some cards that give you more opportunities to get cards off of that main pile. So you start with a scenario, and I also especially like that you actually start with a couple of technology cards. And I think with a lot of deck building games, the first 3 or 4 turns in most deck building games are almost pointless, because you're starting with nothing. You're starting with a generic hand that everybody else has, and you're playing 3 rounds of a game just to get to the point where you can actually make a real decision and take a course of action that you're heading towards. And I never really liked that, because a lot of, it's just it's wasted time, in my opinion, because with these scenario cards, you're starting, it's almost like starting 3 or 4 turns into a game, where now you have your direction, what you're going, and you have some base abilities that work with the direction that you're going. Now, I realize some people are criticizing this and saying, well, it's already now decided what my strategy is going to be. Well, when you're playing a deck game, there's a point in the game fairly early on where you decide what road you're going to go down. And usually when you pick that road, you got to stick with it, because your deck becomes optimized towards that strategy. So what's the difference between starting out with your idea or doing it 2 or 3 turns in the game and wasting 15 minutes to get to that point? So I really like this. And I really disagree with the point that, that's a negative to start with a kind of direction. And it's not like there's only one way to play out how you're doing this. Like, for example, like these cards here are going to lend themselves to gaining a lot of planets with this. So you could take an approach where you're going to be conquering a lot of planets, and this card helps you get resources on your planets as you go and doing some trading. So you could actually get some planets by conquering them, then focus a lot on trading, or just go outright, conquer as many planets as possible, because you're getting so many of them in front of you. So, I mean, there are different ways to play out what you get for a scenario. It's not like you're locked into one way of playing completely. And then when you get other additional technologies, well, then you can open things up in other ways too that might complement what you're doing. So I really think this is brilliant. It's something I would like to see other deck building games go for, is sort of more of a starting way to get your starting hand at something that is interesting, rather than having to play 3 or 4 boring hands before you can actually do anything of value. So I think that is excellent. Okay, so what else? That's basically what has been added to the game. And anytime I think I have to say, as far as expansion designs, this is one of the best expansion designs I've seen, because it's done everything, I think, right. It's added technologies for variety, and I think most people enjoy it when an expansion just adds more of what works in the game, and something that gives you more variety. It's upped the gameplay with the scenarios, and provided that interesting, mechanic where you have something to start with. And then, it also lets you go a little further than you might normally have gone in a game where, 3 or 4 turns are wasted and cards are coming off the decks here, which shorten the game. So it leads to a more interesting end game. And so now I think the game has enough variety where this is going to be a long-term keeper for me because of that, whereas before, without the expansion, it was at a point where, yeah, I've seen it, done it, there's nothing else interesting to me, I'll move on. One of the cool things about this expansion with these scenarios is, hey, maybe you're getting a little tired of the game. Well, choose a scenario that's going to send you in a direction that's going to force you to do something that maybe don't normally play. Maybe it's not how you normally play the game, and pick something that's going to take you in a different direction and see what you can do with it. I think that's really neat, and then there's plenty of scenarios in here to do. So the base game was a solid game to begin with, so now it's even deeper and even better in my opinion. One of the things I wish that had been done is, this mechanic has been added to Warfare, which makes Warfare even more interesting than it was before, and it sort of was the more interesting strategy to play. And Colonize is sort of it's a pretty boring strategy, really. You're going in here and you're placing colonies underneath your card and then flipping it over to colonize it, and that's what you're doing during the game. Whereas Warfare, you were kind of collecting these cool fighters and getting those out, which was a little bit more interesting to begin with. And now they've added another kind of cool element to Warfare. It just makes Warfare more appealing to play. I'm not saying it's better to play or more powerful. It just got more bells and whistles to it. It makes it a little more interesting to play. Nothing was really done with Colonize. And I think the designer said, Colonize is pretty, it's pretty good as it is, and it really didn't need the sort of maybe some of the boosting here. I don't know. I still think maybe something more interesting could have been done with Colonize to kind of get it on par with Warfare. I'm not going to avoid playing Colonize, but it's just not as interesting when you can do all this neat stuff with these technologies in Warfare. Colonize has these things where, your planets can count as your cards, which makes Colonize a pretty powerful strategy. This was added into the deck, so now you can get a fighter regenerated here if there isn't one here at the beginning. I think it's at the beginning of your turn, or at the end. I think it's at the beginning of your turn. It regenerates. And that's another thing, pretty cool thing about Warfare. Let's see. Yeah, there's a couple cards in here that when you dissent on a Warfare roll, you get a point, and that helps Colonize a little bit. So, it's just not as interesting. I wish that something a little bit more had been done with it, but I'm still very, very happy and very satisfied with the game as it is and how it plays out. It's a very rich deck building game. Let's see what the Balls says. And you have the coolest avatar thing I think I've seen. That is awesome. Seriously great game. Some will say it's a Me Too game, but this is more than just the sum of its mechanics. After playing quite a bit, there's a lot of depth in so few cards. The expansion will make a great game even better. And yes, it is an excellent game. It is a Me Too type of a game because a lot of the mechanics have been borrowed from other games. And indeed, I think the expansion does make this game a lot better. Thank you, Balls. Cosmos is Quick says, likes. A quick, high-depth game with pretty simple mechanics. With the following and dissenting mechanic, there's almost no downtime during the game as everyone plays on others' turns. Smooth gameplay and good theme. And I agree with that the game does play very smooth, and the following and dissenting mechanic does give you something to think about between your turns, which is nice too. Dislikes. The only thing I can see happening is that it might start to lose replay value after many plays, since startup and other variables are static. And I found this to be true as well. But as I said before, the expansion, I think, takes care of that problem. I see a lot more replay now, especially with these scenarios and the way that the scenarios do change your setup. Here's a comment from Shoal, or Cholet. She says, very derivative, but has a charm of its own, and it's fun trying out different strategies in the game. Probably the most charming aspect for me is the simplicity, and I think that's representative of how easy it is to get started with the game. I'm going to jump down here to, you don't really get a good run at using your technologies before it's over. With the 2 players, it seems to go on a bit long if the players are running different strategies. 3 players might be about right, but it seems to depend on what strategies the different players are taking. A trade strategy will struggle if the other two players are aggressively following, say, a colonized research strategy. The colonized deck will be depleted quick as a flash, and the game will be a bit of a dud. The more varied the strategy between the players, the more fun the game it seems. It's a weird game in this respect. And I agree with this because the length of the game really depends on the strategies that the players are taking. If they take the same strategy, like colonize, they both take it, the deck's going to be depleted very quickly, and the game's going to be over very quickly. So, you know, that's one of those things that kind of you have to keep in mind when you play. If you know it's going to be a quick game, there are certain things that you're not going to really want to go for anymore. So, yeah, I struggle with that with a two-player too, because it's so different when in a two-player game, if each player picks a different strategy, say warfare and colonize, versus the two players doing the same strategy, the game just blasts by, and there is, because it's the end of the game is dependent upon those decks, and that was something that I don't know. That's one thing that I don't know what you would do to change it, and I can live with it, but I don't like the games that kind of end really quick before you get started. Atherton says, probably my favorite deck building game right now. My only complaint is that it seems like people can always go for the same technology cards each time. Well, their randomly assigned starting world will affect this somewhat. The game also grinds to a halt anytime somebody does research. And yeah, I think that's kind of true about the research thing. When somebody does research, they got to go through a pile of cards and pick the one that they want, unless they already know already. So if the people aren't super familiar with the game, it's going to take them a while every time they do research, and it does kind of put the brakes in the game for a couple of minutes when they do that. Psychosby, who rates this as a 7.0588, says that, while certainly better than the Symbol Crazy Race for the Galaxy, it's also not as good as Dominion. The idea that you get these little plastic spaceships that you use them to attack yourself rather than your opponents really tells you everything you need to know about confrontation phobic Euro designers. At least Dominion has cards like the Militia and Witch. The game reminded me of San Juan. It's been a long time since I played that one. And yeah, even though, you know, there's this concept of warfare in the game, I think it's true. You really are only ever attacking the planets that you have that are your own. You don't really ever interfere with what anybody else does. All you can do in terms of player interaction is sort of piggyback on what they're doing with the following role. So yeah, it isn't very confrontational. Bayushi Cesaru says, I think he put it pretty well here, I see Eminent Domain as the Frankenstein's monster of card games. Its designer took various parts from at least 3 great card games, Race for the Galaxy, Dominion, and Glory to Rome, and put them together. However, he goes on to say, tentative initial rating is 6, so for now I feel Eminent Domain is worse than its 3 ancestors. And yeah, I mean, the game takes from 3 other card games and puts them together. I personally really like Eminent Domain, but I'm not going to argue as to which one's better as far as Race for the Galaxy, Eminent Domain, Glory to Rome, or Dominion. They're all excellent games in themselves. Soccer Star, one of my go-to guys for comments on games here. He goes on to say, where the game fell short is a lack of variety. Once the game was up and running, it became clear there wasn't enough to keep me interested, even through the end of the first game. There are only really 3 types of planets: ones that give you bonuses and so to hand size, symbols for boosting, ones that held multiple resources, and ones that gave you a huge amount of victory points. And because there aren't very many interesting strategies to peruse. Because of that, there aren't very many interesting strategies to peruse during the game. So, I do think that the expansion helps address this question or this problem enough for me, because I was feeling the same way too, that after 7 or 8 plays I was beginning to feel like I'm kind of seeing all I want to see about this game. But so I think the expansion does help, and I'd recommend checking into it. But should you pick this one over Race for the Galaxy, which is another game and that has so much more development for it out already, is it justified picking up Eminent Domain? Unless, I would probably say probably it isn't for most people, because Race for the Galaxy has so much for it already. But I'm happy to own Eminent Domain. And finally, let's go to Opie. The biggest problem with Eminent Domain is its Act 3 problem. And its Act 3 problem is there is no Act 3. The story ends in Act 2, often mid-sentence, and as a result, the ending feels rougher than it should. And I think that's very well put, because the game can come to a crashing halt. And as I said before, like, if everybody is going for, say, colonize, you're going to run through the deck quickly, and the game is going to be over. Whereas if people are more diversified, the game's going to drag on. Because I've heard throughout these comments, some people say the game really drags on, some people say it comes to an abrupt halt. And I think it really depends on how many different directions people are going. If they're going in a lot of different directions, the game's going to go on, maybe almost too long. But if people are piggybacking on the same strategies a lot, the game is going to sometimes come to that crashing end. And that was one of my kind of complaints about the game as well. It wasn't enough for me to say, no, I don't like Eminent Domain, because I really still do enjoy it a lot, especially with the expansion, and I'm going to hold on to it. So, all said and done, with the positives and negatives, I think there are definitely more positives than negatives for a lot of people who own games like Race for the Galaxy, Glory of the Realm, Dominion. Should you go out and pick up Eminent Domain? I guess that really kind of depends on, do you want to pick up another game to explore and get some more variety, or are you satisfied already with what you already have? If you're already satisfied, maybe there isn't a reason to go out and pick up Eminent Domain. But if you do, I feel like it's a pretty good experience, especially with the expansion, and it definitely is enjoyable. Whether or not it's right for you versus those other 3 or 4 games that are similar, that's a tough call, because those other games that are competing with Eminent Domain are really good, high-quality games, and it's really hard to say you should pick one over the other. Well, that's it. Eminent Domain.